Well, I want to welcome all of you. I'm not going to be introducing our guest speaker, but I will introduce the one who will introduce her. But I wanted to give thanks to a couple of organizations in Portland who have joined with me in arranging for this occasion today. I want to thank the faculty of the Judaic Studies program at Portland State University, the staff at the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, the Institute for Judaic Studies in Portland, and of course, our congregation, which sponsors this class. I just want to mention that this is the second world-class Bible scholar that we have had in our congregation during the last years. One of them was Professor James Kugel, who came here from Harvard a number of years ago, now lives in Israel. And the other is our guest today. Both Dr. Kugel and our guest today are here from Yale University. So we want to thank Yale University for supporting Judaic Studies. You can bear that message back to the university. And now I want to call upon Rini Holzman, a member of practically every class in Judaic Studies offered here in Portland, to introduce our guest speaker. Rini? Either one.
Hello. Good morning and welcome to a very special Thursday morning. And that's not to say that every Thursday morning is very special, meeting with Rabbi Stampfer and learning from him. And he makes learning fun for some reason. We have a lot of laughter in our class, and this is also an opportunity for us to get to see each other, which we enjoy. Our guest today is, as Rabbi said, from Yale University, and she is a preeminent biblical scholar. Aren't we lucky to have her here today? And she is going to address the topic, We're No Angels. Really? We're not? Oh. Holiness and Perfectionism in the Bible and Rabbinic Judaism. Is it Dr. Hayes? That's fine. Here you go.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome. I want to make sure that you're picking this up all right. Is this a good distance from the microphone? Okay, good. But thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you to Rabbi Stampfer for the invitation, and thank you to his colleagues and staff. Everyone's been very helpful, Lindsay and Lisa and Dina and now Angie and so on. I really appreciate all that everyone has done to make me so comfortable. This is my first time in Oregon. It is a beautiful state. I can see just a little bit that I've caught a glimpse of, and I hope to return at other times. I understand that your studies have brought you, I think, to the book of Leviticus. I think that's roughly where you are, and to the section of Leviticus, chapters 17 to 27, that are known as the Holiness Code, or the Holiness Source. And this block of text has earned its name because it emphasizes the concept of holiness. And it contains repeated exhortations to the Israelites to strive for holiness. Right? God says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." So today what I'd like to do is to talk with you about this aspiration to holiness. What does it mean in the biblical context to aspire to holiness? And how did some of the earliest readers of the Bible come to understand this biblical aspiration to holiness? So we're not just going to talk about the Bible, we're going to talk about its reception and its interpretation in early Judaism, and particularly Rabbinic Judaism. What did earliest readers think about this aspiration to holiness? Did they think that we can achieve holiness? And if so, how is it achieved? What does it even look like? And we'll see that different Jews gave different answers to this question. And we're going to focus particularly on the somewhat surprising answer of the rabbis of the Talmud, of Rabbinic Judaism. But we're going to start at the beginning. And that is to say, the holiness source in Leviticus 17 through 27. Now, it urges Israel, as I said, to be holy because God is holy. So what does that mean? Well, the Hebrew word kadosh, and I think I talk about this a little bit in the book, the Hebrew word kadosh, or holy, comes from a root that simply means separate and separate. That which is holy is separate, meaning it's withdrawn from common everyday use. Now, in the view of the holiness source, the only thing that's intrinsically holy in and of itself is God. God is by his nature separate and distinct from everything else in the cosmos. Things in the created world become holy when they're transferred over to God's realm or separated from the ordinary realm to the realm of God. What does that mean? How do things become separated from the ordinary realm and made holy or sanctified? That's what sanctified means, right? Well, according to Leviticus, we make things holy when we observe certain rules and safeguards that mark them out as different or distinct or separate from ordinary things. So there are 7 days in the week, right? But only one of them is holy, and that's the Sabbath. What makes it holy? The fact that Israel observes different rules in regard to that day that they don't observe on other days. That day there's no working, no buying, no selling, no lighting of fire. So the holy character of a thing is maintained in the Sabbath by observing rules and prohibitions for that day only. You behave differently or act differently towards a thing than you do other days of the week. So if work were done on the Sabbath, it would be desacralized or desecrated. That's all desecrated means, made not sacred and treated like it was an ordinary thing. Similarly, an object like a vessel can be made holy or sacred by withdrawing it from ordinary use and giving it over, say, to the temple, where only the sacred priests on sacred occasions would use that vessel. And if you used it for ordinary purposes, you would be desacralizing it, just treating it as ordinary. But the Holiness Code talks about more than just the Sabbath or vessels. It talks about people being sacred. Leviticus urges Israel to aspire to holiness. Be holy, it says. So how? Well, in exactly the same way, by observing certain rules that mark the Israelites as a distinct people, separated from the nations and to God. So just as the Sabbath is sanctified only when the rules that distinguish it from the other days of the week are observed, so Israel's status as a holy people is realized only when Israel observes the rules that distinguish it from the other nations and mark it as the special possession of God. That's why the exhortation to Israel to be holy, if you look through those chapters in Leviticus 17 through 27, where do those exhortations occur? They're always connected with an exhortation to observe the law or some key element in the law. So in Leviticus 20, for example, verses 7 to 8, regarding the laws of sexual morality, the text says, be holy, v'hit kadishtem, v'hitem kadoshim. You shall make yourselves holy, you shall sanctify yourselves. Oh, this is text 1. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I, the Lord, am your God. You shall faithfully observe my laws that I just listed here in this, or I'm about to list in this chapter. I, the Lord, make you holy. Or in connection with the dietary laws, we see that in text 2 on the handout. Leviticus 11, so this is the priestly source, not quite the Holiness Code, says, for I, the Lord, am he who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. These are the instructions concerning the animals that you may eat, the clean and unclean, and so on, right? So by observing the dietary laws, you mark yourself off as different from other people, or separate and belonging to me. So the exhortation to be holy always goes along with the rules that you have to observe to make that separation or that difference. Aspiration to holiness is inescapable then from observing the teachings and obligations of God, the Torah, the teachings of the Torah, because they separate Israel from other people to God. Now we can connect the exhortation to be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. We can connect that to another idea that's found in the priestly sections of the Bible, and that's the idea that humans were created in the image of God. So if you've talked already about Genesis 1, I'll refer to a couple of ideas that are pointed out in the book there. In Genesis 1, the creation of humankind is the climactic act of creation, as you know. And as a sign of humankind's special importance, God says, and this is text 3 on your handout, let us make Adam, right, the earthling, in our image after our likeness. Nase Adam b'tzalmeinu, kidmutenu, our image, our likeness. I'm emphasizing that for a reason we'll come back to. So that only humans are made in the divine image, no other animal is. And in the second creation story, in Genesis 2 and 3, we read that God breathes the breath of God, right, into humans, again, marking them as somehow distinct. If you'll see in text 4, this is a verse from the Psalm 8, verse 5, referring to humans. It says, you have made him a little less than a Elohim. Like they're just about divine beings, right? Just a little lower on the scale of creation. So this concept of the divine in human beings, or some divine image or element in human beings, that breaks with the conception of humankind that you find among Israel's ancient Near Eastern neighbors. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. In the Babylonian creation myth, Babylon was next door. That myth is called Enuma Elish, and there humans are not even part of the original creation plan. They are unimportant menials. They're slaves of the god who have little reciprocal interest in them or concern for them. The gods create them really as an afterthought to relieve themselves of the hard work of running the universe. So they're slaves and menials. But in Genesis, we have the antithesis of this idea. Humankind is the peak and the purpose of creation. And God's first communication is concern for the physical needs of this creature, their continued growth and their welfare. He blesses them immediately after creating them. He tells them to be fertile and increase and to fill the earth and master it, and he provides them with food. They're vegetarian, by the way, in creation. So humans are creatures of majesty and dignity in Genesis 1. They're filled with the divine breath. They have this special connection with God. So it makes sense then, perhaps, to urge humans to continue to aspire to be as holy, as separate from other nations, and as close to God as possible. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You alone have something of the divine in you, and you should aspire to realize that divine something as fully as possible, right? Aspire. All right, now if all of that is true, then what are we to make of the following statement that occurs in the Talmud? I think it might be on your handout, I'm not sure. Lo nitna Torah lemalachei hasharet. The Torah was not given to ministering angels. Did I put it there? Yes. Good, okay, thank you. I didn't mark that here. The Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. This is a phrase that we find a few times in the Talmud, 4 times exactly, actually. The 4 times it occurs in a legal context. They're talking about things you should do. And it's stated in order to stop a line of reasoning that would place a high burden on individuals or the community who are trying to observe the law. I think of it as a way of saying, we're no angels. You can't expect behavior X from us. That's way too high a bar. We don't have to aspire to that. And so that seems a little bit strange to me to find that in rabbinic literature. It's strange for 2 reasons. First of all, to say, though, the Torah was not given to ministering angels, it seems to assume that humans and angels are very radically distinct things. They're totally discontinuous with one another. We're not at all angels, right? But as we've just seen in the Bible, humans don't really appear to be that radically distinct from divine beings. Humans are created in the image and likeness of the divine, right? Whatever that might mean, but they are created in the image of Elohim. They're filled with the divine breath. According to Psalm 8, they're created just a little lower than divine beings. They don't seem to be that radically different. Maybe we should aspire to be like them. And then the phrase is also strange for another reason, right? The phrase, the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. It's also strange for another reason, because it seems to be anti-aspirational. It's an excuse for leniency, for lowering expectations of ourselves, a kind of concession to our imperfection or inadequacy, rather than spurring us to virtue. And that seems strange, to say that humans don't need to aspire to an angelic perfection or a greater perfection because we're not angels. Don't aspire to a higher standard. that seems odd because biblical tradition, I think, is explicitly aspirational. One should continue to strive to be as close to God as one can. And in fact, as we just noted, the Torah is itself, in the Bible, the instrument for that. It's the Torah that will help humans to realize that aspiration. And now here the rabbis are saying the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. That's a little out of keeping with the biblical text. I mean, after all, when the Torah is given at Sinai, in Exodus 19, God says, if you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, mamlechet kohanim. Kohanim, priests are holy, and a holy nation, an am kadosh. So the Torah was given to make Israel an am kadosh. And as we saw, the holiness source explicitly states that by observing the Torah, then Israel can realize this exhortation to be holy like God. So realizing this aspiration to holiness, that seems to be the very purpose of the Torah. So again, how do we explain this odd Talmudic statement? The Torah wasn't given to ministering angels, which seems to lower expectations and aspirations. So what I thought I'd do today is to show you how this phrase, when properly understood in its original context in the Talmud, actually supports an aspirationalism, one that I think is perhaps really what the Bible meant, and a striving towards a greater perfection. Now, to understand that, to understand what the phrase in the Talmud really means and why it was perhaps radical in its own time, we first have to look at those ministering angels that the rabbis say we are not. Because it turns out that in ancient times, just as today, people often use angels to think about what it is to be human. When we're thinking about what humans should aspire to be, we often conjure up angels. Is the best and most perfect human type imagined as an angel or angel-like, and what does that even mean? Now, ancient Jews didn't agree on the answer to that question. They don't tend to agree on much of anything, but they didn't agree on the answer to those questions that I just asked. And I'm going to divide their answers into two different groups. According to the first group, and this is an idea that we see just after the close of the Bible, the 2 or 3 centuries before zero, right? So before the rabbis are on the scene. The idea that we see then is that humans really are essentially like angels. They're continuous with angels. We really can aspire to be more and more like angels and more angelic. And that view depends on some of the passages from the Bible I've already pointed to. We're created in the image of God, or we're created just a little bit lower on the scale of creation from angels, from Elohim, whatever those divine things are. But then there's a second view that comes along in the 1st or the 2nd century with the rabbis. And that view is that humans are not like angels at all. We're totally discontinuous with them. We shouldn't be trying to be like angels. But that doesn't mean we don't have aspirations. Our aspirations just lie in a different direction. So those are the two views I want to chart out, and some of the texts I think will be pretty inspirational about aspiration. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the first view that arose right after the close of the Bible, that humans and angels are kind of continuous, because by doing that, we'll see why the rabbis' view was in some ways so revolutionary, their view that we're not like them and that we're discontinuous. So let me spend a few minutes first with this first view. On this first view, and we see this in the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century before zero, humans are basically continuous with divine beings. There's this continuous chain of creation that begins with God at the top, and then divine beings, and then humans are next, just a little bit lower, and then we can keep going down the scale to sort of the world that we see around us. So we rank just a little lower than angels, and in fact, we share many features with them. Angels just have those features more perfectly than us. But if we could just perfect those features that we share with angels, then we really could be angelic and draw very close to the divine. And so it's appropriate to think about angels and their perfections and then to model ourselves on them and try to be like them. Well, different ancient Jews had different ideas about the features of angels that we share and that we should try to perfect to become more angelic. Number 6 on your handout gives you a little summary of the 3 different ideas that ancient Jews had about what made angels perfect and what we should try to make more perfect to be more angelic. So for some of them, it's rational perfection. So you can guess, these were philosophers, right? This is what ancient philosophers and Jewish philosophers thought. Angels, they said, that just means pure intelligences, just pure, like a brain in a vat, just pure intelligences. And to aspire to angelic perfection is to aspire to rational perfection and true, pure knowledge. So as I said, that's the view of Jewish philosophers who lived in Greek environments. You may have heard of one of them, Philo. He was a philosopher in the 1st century, and this was very much his view. He wrote that through the Torah, which taught truth and philosophy, we could achieve rational perfection, and that brought us closer to angelic beings and the divine. So he was very much influenced by the Greek philosophical tradition, where reason is the element we share with the gods, and by perfecting our reason, like a philosopher, we become more divine, more angelic, more godlike. It was Greek philosophers, by the way, who said that. You should be aware. They're the ones who think that the most godlike creatures are the philosophers, just in case you were wondering. I'm married to a philosopher, so I know how that works. So that was one view, and it was mostly kind of Jewish philosophers who held that. But a much more common view said that the perfection of angels was a perfection of the will, meaning that angels align their will always with the will of God and never disobey. They're not tempted to do evil. That's why they're angels, right? They don't sin. And they don't sin because they're not tempted to sin, because they don't have any moral freedom. So angels lack moral freedom. That's why they're utterly obedient. But it also means they're kind of automatons, right? I have a phrase for this. I call it robo-righteousness. The idea that you're utterly obedient. But that's because you have no choice. But that's what angels are. So to aspire to an angelic perfection is to aspire to utter obedience to the will of God, either by just overcoming the temptation to sin or trying to eliminate free will altogether, just wishing that we didn't even have free will. And there were a lot of Jews at that time who wished that. So, perfection of the will. But then for other Jews, the perfection of angels was, believe it or not, a perfection of their bodies. So people in antiquity believed that angels had bodies, but they had more perfect bodies than us, because their bodies weren't made out of flesh and blood, which can decay and which is subject to all sorts of pains and deprivations. We get hungry, we get thirsty, we get tired, that makes us crabby, and then we sin. So it's by having a body, that's what keeps messing us up. But angels, they have bodies, but they're ethereal bodies. They're not made of flesh and blood that decays or feels pain. Their bodies are ethereal, like fire. Seraphim are angels made of fire, we see in the book of Isaiah. So they felt they had bodies, but they were immortal bodies that didn't decay and didn't suffer pain. And so if we could just perfect our bodies, or overcome our bodies, if you will, or even eliminate or suppress our physical bodies, we could be more angelic, right? We could be more divine. Maybe by learning to endure physical pain or eliminating the passions and desires that distract us. Then we could arrive at obedience to God and undisturbed virtue. These last two ideas, that angelic perfection of the will and angelic perfection of the body, we find these in the writings of many ancient Jewish groups in those centuries before the rabbis arose, including the sectarians who lived at Qumran. So hopefully you've heard of this community of Jewish sectarians who lived in the desert. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the scrolls that were preserved by that community, so that's how we know about their writings and their beliefs. And so they, in their writings, they describe angels as pure beings who do not feel these impulses and desires and disturbances of the flesh, as obedient servants whose will is always aligned with the will of God. They execute his commands automatically. They're not even tempted to disobey. What would that even be? Or they also are described as worshipers of God. They continually sing his praise in devout obeisance. So humans should strive to be like that if they want to be more perfect, right? They should strive for all three of these things. They should strive for bodily purity and utter obedience and perfect worship. So, for example, the sectarians who lived in the enclave at Qumran, they were known for their strict observance of the purity laws, for denying the impulses and desires of the flesh. The bodily life is an impediment to holiness. You can't be holy if you're focused on the life of the body. For this reason, they were celibate. We've only found the bones of men at Qumran. I think they found 3 female skeletons out of the hundreds. They can't quite figure out what they were doing there, but in general, the community was a celibate community because you maximize your divinity, they believe. You maximize your divine spiritual element when you minimize or deny your carnal body and its needs and its desires, because the body is incompatible with the desire for holiness. So keep that in mind, all right? That's the view before the rabbis. In addition to that bodily purity, they also pursued a life of strict obedience to the details of the law. Some Jews at this time went so far as to lament the fact that humans have free will, even though I think the Bible sort of celebrates that, and that's why God loves humans. Here we have people lamenting the fact that we have free will. It just gets us into trouble all the time because we disobey. A Jew named Paul, for example, longed for a time when free will would be eradicated, and we would simply obey God in a kind of automatic robo-righteous way. In addition to bodily purity and utter obedience without any temptation to sin, many of these Jews sought to line up their worship with the worship of the heavenly beings. The heavenly beings are worshiping God at various points, and that's why the sectarians who lived at Qumran followed a different calendar. I don't know if you know this, but they rejected this interesting mixed lunar solar calendar that the rest of the Jewish community followed in Jerusalem, and that's followed to this very day. They had a 364-day calendar that was based only on the movements of the sun, or is it 354? My math and astronomy are not good. But anyway, it was a fixed calendar, and it wasn't the calendar that the other Jews followed. And in their writings, they tell us that they believe that's the calendar God established at the time of creation. And they have their calendar worked out from the first 7 days of creation, marking all the way through down until their day. They celebrate the festivals and Yom Kippur on days when other Jews did not celebrate them. According to them, they were celebrating them on the true divine dates of those festivals, and they were synchronizing their worship of the festivals and their observance of the festivals and holy days with their observance in the heavens. They said the angels are practicing Sukkot now. This is when we're going to practice Sukkot. They also tried to line up their daily prayers and worship of God each day with the prayers and worship of the angels. And they believed that when they did that, they transcended the earthly realm and they joined the community of angels worshiping God and really became one with them. That's what it was at Qumran, to aspire to angelic perfection. So we've seen that if you think of angels and humans as just occupying slightly different ranks on a continuous chain of creation, then that's going to support the idea that we should aspire to keep moving along that chain of creation and we should aspire to be more like angels, to achieve an angelic perfection of mind, reason, or body, or will. So that continuity view in which angels represent a perfection to which humans should aspire, that view dominates ancient Jewish writings in that 300-year period between the Bible and the rise of the rabbis. And in those writings, it's really funny. The angels just take over. God becomes very remote. And the angels start to get names. We start to know names of them. We don't really know the names of angels in the Bible until we get to the book of Daniel. They're just messengers. They just do God's will in a few places here and there. But in this literature after the Bible, they develop personalities, and they have portfolios and job descriptions, and they run the cosmos. God's really not there. Different ones run different heavenly bodies. Some of them have a job of being tour guides. They give tours of heaven to those who come up, like Enoch, to take a look around. So this literature is filled with these angels and the aspiration to be like them. But as I mentioned, in the newly emerging rabbinic movement, which begins end of the late first century, after the destruction, this is when the rabbinic movement really starts to take form, you have a different view that starts to creep up. They still have this continuous view, but they start to see a new view creeping up, and mostly associated with Rabbi Akiva, if you've heard of him. And according to this view, humans are not like angels at all. We're discontinuous with them. Rational perfection eludes us. We can't achieve perfect obedience to the will of God either by completely overcoming the desire for sinful behavior sometimes or just eliminating moral freedom altogether. We always have moral choice. And we can't transcend or do away with our carnal bodies to become these incorporeal, deathless beings. We're just not like them at all. And so it's not appropriate for humans to try to be like angels or to aspire to become like angels in this life or in any other life. They're just not appropriate models for human beings. And the idea of imitating angels is just confusion. So we're going to see the two dueling perspectives between two rabbinic characters in the next text 7. So these two characters lived at the beginning of the 2nd century. So Rabbi Papias expounded. He's interpreting a verse from Genesis 3 where God says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us." Rabbi Papias expounded that phrase, "Behold, the man has become like one of us," to mean he's become like one of the ministering angels. So he's kind of typical of a lot of the views of the time. And Rabbi Akiva said to him, "Dai, enough, Papias. Like, stop, be quiet." And Papias said to him, "Well, then how do you interpret, 'Behold, the man has become like one of us'?" And Rabbi Akiva answered him, "Not like one of the ministering angels, but rather it means that God set before him two paths, the path of life and the path of death, and he chose for himself the path of death." What does he mean? So Rabbi Papias espouses this continuity view we've talked about. But according to Rabbi Akiva, no, humans are not like ministering angels for the reason that humans are not programmed for obedience like angels. We have moral freedom. So we're more like God than we are like angels, because God also knows the difference between good and evil and is free to choose his actions. He chooses good, but he knows the difference. And so when God says humans have become like one of us, according to Rabbi Akiva, he means that humans, after eating the apple, discover that they have moral freedom and they can disobey God. They discover that there's a path of life and a path of death that they have to choose between, right? They possess moral freedom as opposed to the angels, unlike the ministering angels who cannot choose to disobey, right? So here we see the debate. And Rabbi Akiva thinks that because angels lack moral freedom, they're irrelevant. They don't know what it's like to be a human. And so they're irrelevant for us as models of human behavior because we have moral freedom in the moral struggle. Now, that doesn't mean that Rabbi Akiva is anti-aspirational, doesn't think we should strive to be better. It's all a matter of finding the appropriate model for our aspirations. Rabbi Akiva and those who think that we are discontinuous with the angels do support aspirationalism, but one in which humans strive to become not more angelic, but more fully and more perfectly human. Can never quite get there. So human aspirationalism can't be modeled on beings who lack moral freedom. It must be modeled on the only other entity that possesses moral freedom, and that is God. Imitatio Dei, imitation of God. So the rabbis bring us back to the holiness code. When God says, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy," he means be like me, not like animals who don't have moral freedom, and not like angels or other divine beings, neither of whom know the difference between good and evil, neither of whom have moral freedoms. Angels and animals, they don't know the difference. They don't have moral freedom. They're not capable of moral action. Be like me, he says, and not like them. And here I think the rabbis are picking up on a very subtle detail in Genesis 1. If you turn back to text 3, take a look at that verse again. As we saw in Genesis 1, verse 26, God proposes to make humans in our image. B'tsalmenu kidmutenu, plural, in our image, implying in the image of divine beings, right, or angels generally. But then in the very next verse, when God actually does create the human, what does it say? V'yivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tsalmo, and God made humankind in his image, singular. It switches to singular. So for some ancient readers, like the rabbis, this detail indicated to them that God first considered making humans like angels, right? Make them like us, like divine beings, like you angels, obedient servants, incapable of moral choice or incapable of ever sinning, like God, always choosing good. No, in the end, he thought about that, but then he decided in the end to make them like himself with moral freedom. And they soon learn that they do, in fact, have moral freedom when they first exercise it by disobeying, right? And so Rabbi Akiva and some other rabbis emphasize the creation of humans in the image of God, meaning God rather than angels. And they promote imitation of God rather than imitation of angels against many of the other people in their environment, other ancient Jews and also early Christians. And this idea, I think, is beautifully articulated by a young scholar who's here on the West Coast. I think she's at the University of Washington, Mika Ahuvia. She wrote a dissertation, I think it's now a book, called Israel Among the Angels. And she says that the idea that humans were created in the image of God rather than angels, and that they're especially beloved because of it, led the rabbis to a very negative image of angels. And we find in rabbinic literature very negative portraits of angels. She writes this: the rabbis ultimately modeled their self-conception and their self-understanding on God, not the angels. And this principle impacts their treatment of his divine servants. And we see this in a whole series of rabbinic stories in which humans and angels are antagonistic rivals. Some of them are pretty funny, actually. One scholar, who's named Peter Schaefer, he gathered together a number of these rabbinic stories that pit angels and humans against one another. And in these stories, angels express opposition to humans in connection with three major events in the Bible: the creation itself, the revelation of the Torah at Sinai, and God's descent to the the descent of the Shekhinah to fill the sanctuary at the end of the book of Exodus, right? When it's completed, God's Shekhinah comes down and dwells in the sanctuary. Those three things stoke the angels' jealousy. They're really furious about it in these rabbinic stories. They see these events, creation and revelation and the descent of God's presence, as an emblem of God's involvement with and love for humans, and they can't understand why he likes humans. They're so imperfect. So we're going to take a look at some of these texts where the angels really express their opposition to humans. Text 8 is a fairly famous rabbinic story about how the angels oppose the very creation of humankind. And the reason they oppose it is that humans are just no good. According to some of the angels, God's holiness and his justice are incompatible with just the inherent unworthiness and sinfulness of humans, and humans shouldn't be created. So this is a rabbinic story, or a midrash, right? A midrash is a rabbinic interpretation of something in the Bible. What they're actually interpreting here is a psalm. You can see the italic letters. Those are passages from the psalm. So Psalm 85, verses 11 and 12 read, "Love and truth are found together. Righteousness and peace combated each other." That's 11, but 12 then goes on, "Let truth spring up from the earth." The rabbis looked at that and they thought, what is this talking about? Love and truth are wrangling with each other. Righteousness and peace are wrangling. Truth has to jump up from the ground. How did it get down on the ground? What's going on? So to explain this psalm, they wrote this story. And they see love and truth and righteousness and peace as names of angels. So here's their story. Rabbi Shimon said, "When the Holy One, blessed be he, came to create Adam, the ministering angels formed themselves into groups and parties," right? Some are for, some are against. Some of them saying, "Let him be created," while others argued, "Oh, let him not be created." All right? And thus it is written. That's what Psalm 85 means when it says, "Love and truth found together," arguing. Righteousness and peace combating each other, they're arguing. Love says, "Let him be created because he will dispense acts of love." But truth said, "Let him not be created because he is compounded of falsehood." Righteousness said, "Let him be created, he will perform righteous deeds." And peace said, "Let him not be created, he's full of strife." So what did the Lord do? He took truth and cast it to the ground. The ministering angels said before the Holy One, blessed be he, sovereign of the universe, why do you despise your seal? Let truth arise from the earth. That's why the next verse in the psalm says, let truth spring up from the earth. Rav Huna, the elder of Sepphoris, said, while the ministering angels were arguing with each other and disputing with each other, the Holy One, blessed be he, created him. And then he said to them, what are you arguing for? Man has already been made. Well, yes, you laugh appropriately, so it's a great text. God has to resort to a kind of subterfuge. He has to trick the angels. He has to silence one of them, so now it's 2 against 1, and the creation party can win, But he has to resort to this kind of ruse and trick the angels. He has to ignore those who are defending his own holiness and justice. He has to align himself with his love and his mercy in order to create humans. But he does this because humans are so beloved to him. The angels also express opposition. It's not just to God's, not just to creation, but opposition to God giving Israel the Torah. They're mere mortals, and this occasions real jealousy. They harp on the extent to which the humans are just unworthy of God's love and attention and gifts. Why is he so obsessed with these creatures? And especially giving them the Torah, that's his fairest gift. We see this in text number 9. When the Holy One, blessed be he, announced his intention of giving his Torah to Israel, the ministering angels said to the Holy One, blessed be he, Sovereign of the universe, you are he whose majesty is over the heaven. It is your happiness, your glory, and your praise that the Torah should be in heaven. It doesn't belong on earth, it belongs in heaven. And he said to them, well, what does it matter to you? And they said, well, because perhaps tomorrow you'll cause your divine presence to abide in the lower world. This is just the thin edge of the wedge. You give them the Torah, next thing you know, you're going to be visiting with them every other day. We're never going to see you. And then the Holy One, blessed be he, replied to them, I will give my Torah to the dwellers on earth, but I will abide with the celestial beings. I will give away my daughter with her marriage portion to another country in order that she may pride herself with her husband in her beauty and charm and be honored as befits a king's daughter, but I will abide with you in the upper world. But Rabbi Shimon said in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, wherever God made his law to abide, there he made his divine presence to abide. He was just calming them down. The angels are protesting, the Torah belongs in the heaven with us, but God gives the Torah away anyway, and then he kind of covers up and hides his great preference for Israel. Yeah, I'll stay with you, angels, but in fact, he's always wherever his Torah is. In text number 10, the angels are said to covet the Torah. And should you say that I have given you the law to your disadvantage, know that I have given it for your benefit. For the ministering angels coveted it. They wanted it. But it was hidden from them. I gave it just to you as a special gift, even though the angels wanted it. And then they cite a verse from Job, and they decode that verse as proving their point. The verse says, seeing that it is hid from the eyes of all living and kept close from the flying beings of the air. The rabbis read that to mean, seeing that it is hidden from the eyes of all living, those are the animals, and kept close from the flying beings, those are the angels of the air, and given to humans. But things get really heated in the following few texts that we're going to look at. In text number 11, this is referring to Moses going up to receive the Torah at Sinai. So in Exodus 19, verse 3, we read, and Moses went up unto God. So text number 11 is going to start with that verse. Moses went up unto God at Sinai to get the Torah. Then they're going to cite a verse from the Psalms where it is written, you have ascended on high, meaning you've been elevated and championed, Moses. What is the meaning of you have ascended on high? It means that you, Moses, have been exalted because you wrestled with angels on high. How do we know this? Well, at that moment that he went to get the Torah, the rabbis say, the angels wanted to attack Moses. But God made the features of Moses resemble those of Abraham and said to the angels, aren't you ashamed to touch this man to whom you descended from heaven and whose house you ate? Hopefully you remember Genesis 18, where Abraham receives 3 mysterious visitors who are said to be sort of angels of God. So God does a quick little, plastic surgery on Moses, makes him look like Abraham, says, angel, he hosted you in his house. How could you possibly harm him? So it's a wonderfully humorous story. Once again, God has to resort to this ruse to overcome these malicious angels and benefit humans and give them the Torah. So in the next story, this is number 12, God is going to help Moses get away with the Torah in a slightly different way. Now, here, the rabbis are talking about that moment in the biblical story in Exodus. He's concluded teaching the Torah to Moses in Exodus, and he's handed over the tablets. And right at the end of that, in Exodus 31, and then in Exodus 32, there's the golden calf incident, right? Right, in 32. And then we jump back up to the top of the mountain. Moses is holding the tablets. He's all ready to go down and seal the deal with Israel. And God says, wait a minute, the whole thing is off because of the golden calf. And the angels seize the moment. Great, now we can go and we can kill Moses. That's what the rabbis imagined happened. So in verse 12, Rabbi Isaac said, when God said to Moses, go, get down because the Israelites have sinned, I'm not going to. Moses' face darkened so that he became as one blind on account of his many troubles. And he didn't know from which side to descend, right? He's devastated. What's going on? And so the angels sought to kill him, saying, now is the time to slay him. But God knew the intention of the angels, so what did he do? He opened up a little hatch door. He opened up a little window under his throne of glory, and he said, "Go, get thee down." In other words, we've been misreading Exodus 32 all this time. We thought God was angry and said, "Go, get down," because the people have sinned. Actually, he opened a little hatch door and said, "Go, quick, get down with the Torah before the angels stop you." Everything's about tone of voice in the Bible, and that's what I love. When the rabbis read the Bible, they try out all these different tones of voice, and it really creates different interpretations. In a particularly marvelous reversal of the angel's insistence that it's humans who are unworthy for Torah, we have the next text, number 13. God said to Israel, "My children, the law is too abstruse, it's too difficult for the ministering angels, but for you, it is not too abstruse." Wow, right? How do we know this, the rabbis say? Well, just look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, which says, "For this commandment, this Torah, which I command you this day, it is not too hard for you." It goes on. You don't have to go to the heavens and get it or go across the sea. It's right here at your hand, right? That's the verse. "For this commandment, which I command you this day, it's not too hard for you." And the rabbis say, yeah, for you, but it is too hard for the ministering angels. So notice that these rabbinic texts are using this strategy of irony and ironic reversal. In these stories, humans, even though they may be carnal, and even though they may make mistakes and be sin-prone, they actually act much more admirably than the angels do here. And I think that's part of the rabbis' humorous attack on some of the ideas of other ancient Jews or early Christians. They're saying that these other writings glorify angels because they're ethereal and incorporeal and pure, obedient servants of God. But look how they depict the angels. Very unflattering terms. They're petty, they're jealous, they're vicious, they're even violent in their interactions with Moses. Why should humans aspire to be like them, right? And all of the rivalry reaches a peak in a fantastic, and I always say this is actually my favorite passage from the Talmud. This is going to be text number 14. But to understand how this text works, we need to understand a little bit about what the rabbis are doing when they're trying to interpret a passage from the Bible in this text. The passage that they're trying to interpret is Psalm 8. So I put Psalm 8 on your handout, which begins, "O Lord," it begins in verse 2, right? "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout all the earth, you who have covered the heavens with your splendor." Notice your name in the earth, your splendor in the heavens. But notice if you jump down to the bottom to verse 10, how does it end? It repeats the first half of verse 2, but not the second. It says, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth." But it leaves out the second part. You've covered the heavens with your splendor. That's the kind of thing that makes the rabbi's ears prick up. Why would we have that contradiction? The rest of the psalm, the whole thing, is really expressing amazement that God bothers with human beings. That's what this psalm is about. So really beginning with verse 4. "When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place," right, all this great stuff, "what is man that you have been mindful of him? Mortal man that you have taken note of him, that you have made him a little less than Elohim." That's that verse that we talked about at the beginning. "And you've adorned him with glory and majesty." Why? You've made him master over everything, laying everything at his earth. Pretty astonishing, given how incredible the cosmos is, that you waste your time with man. You could read it a couple of ways. Either it's amazed how wonderful humans are and how much you must love us to elevate us in this way, or you could read it as kind of disgusted. What are you doing wasting your time with humans? So the rabbis said, who would recite such a psalm? Who would have said this? It was those ministering angels, those angels who are so jealous. They're saying to God, what are you bothering with man for? All right, so that will help you now to read with me the story in the Talmud, which tries to explain this particular psalm. And all right, so we will begin. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi also said, "When Moses ascended on high, up on Sinai, to get the Torah, the ministering angels said to the Holy One, blessed be he, Sovereign of the universe, what business has one born of woman amongst us?" Right? So right away you insult them by pointing out that they're flesh and blood and they die and are born, not like angels who are deathless and have no bodies and don't have to have sex or any of that, right? One born of women, right? What business has one born of woman amongst us? And God said, he's come to receive the Torah. I have to imagine, I always imagine this, and I talk about this elsewhere in another video, but I always imagine this because I think the rabbis' scenes should always be performed. And so when I teach them often in classes, I get students to perform them, that God and Moses are having this very wonderful, close, intimate conversation. God is teaching Moses Torah, and he's just finished dusting everything off, and he's handing over the tablets, and then the door flings open. They're having this private moment, and the door flings open, and there are the ministering angels. You know, what's going on here? Why are you giving him that? Right, that's the scene that we have here, okay? So what's going on? Why are you giving this to one born of woman, my mother's pearls? Why are you giving it? Okay. God says he's come to receive the Torah. And they said to him, that secret treasure, which has been hidden by you for 974 generations before the world was created, you wish to give to flesh and blood? Citing the psalm now, what is man that you have been so mindful of him, mortal man that you have taken note of him? See, that was the angels who said that psalm. O Lord, our Lord, beginning of the psalm, how majestic is your name through the earth, you who have covered the heavens with your splendor. What is your splendor? The Torah. Your name is in the earth, fine, but the Torah is in the heaven. Let them praise you on earth, but the Torah should be in heaven. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, oh gosh, I don't know what to say. Moses, give them an answer. This is why this is my favorite passage in Talmudic literature. God is gobsmacked. They caught me. I don't know. What do I say? And Moses, sovereign of the universe, he replied, I fear that they will consume me with the fiery breath of their mouths. He said, well, hold on to the throne of glory, but give them an answer. And Moses said, okay, sovereign of the universe, this Torah, which you gave me, what's written in it? I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And God says, well, it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Moses says, oh, that's good, I can use that. Okay, angels, did you go down to Egypt? Were you enslaved by Pharaoh? Why then should the Torah be yours? Okay, God, what else is written in it? And God says, it says, you shall have no other gods. Oh, good, I'll use that. Angels, do you dwell among other peoples that worship idols, right? Are you tempted to worship other gods? Okay, God, what else is written in it? And God says, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That's a good one. Moses says, angels, do you perform work that you need to rest? What else, God? What else is written in it? And God says, well, you shall not take the name of God in vain. And Moses says, are there any, here's a pun, any business dealings with you? Taking the name in vain, tisa, they do a pun, masa is business. So they do a little pun there. Is there business dealings among you, angels? Again, what else, God? What else is written in it? God says, well, it says honor your father and mother. Angels, do you have fathers and mothers? Again, he asks God, what's written in it? Well, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. And Moses says, is there jealousy among you? Is the evil tempter among you? You don't have these moral struggles, you're just always obedient, right? Immediately, they conceded. Moses won the argument. They conceded to the Holy One, blessed be he. Actually, it should be to Moses. He was the one who did all the work. As it is said, this is why we read in the last verse of the psalm in verse 10, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. The second part of the phrase, you who covered the heavens with your splendor, your Torah, is not written because they allowed the Torah to go to earth and not keep it in heaven. And immediately each one was inspired to love him, Moses, and each one gave him something and so on, etc. Okay. I love this midrash because the angels object that God's treasure, the Torah, shouldn't be given to mere mortals of flesh and blood. And Moses responds that, on the contrary, the Torah is specifically designed for and can ultimately only be fulfilled by individuals of flesh and blood, persons who are born of parents, persons who engage in business, persons who have bodies that get tired and need rest. The Torah was intended and designed for humans, and humans find their human perfection in fulfilling the Torah in their embodied and morally free state, not in seeking to transcend or transform their bodies or eliminate their moral freedom. Those were ideals that other ancient Jews and early Christians may have had, to try to live as incorporeal angels without moral freedom. The rabbis are saying, no, the Torah was given to humans, not despite their embodied natures, not despite the fact that we're not angels, but because of it. In short, the embodied nature of humans and our capacity to do evil sometimes, that's compatible with our aspiration for greater perfection, not an obstacle to it, as so many others in that period believed. So now we're in a position to finally try to understand the phrase, that I cited earlier. The Torah was not given to ministering angels. Lo nitna Torah lemalachei hasharet. It's used 4 times in the Talmud. And in all 4 times, the embodied nature of humans is at issue. Now, 2 of these cases involve reciting the Shema, right? The twice daily prayer that Jews say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Now, it's a legal principle in rabbinic writings that one should avoid reciting the Shema while naked or in the vicinity of excrement. Seem like pretty simple points, but the rabbis spend a fair amount of time talking about that. Seeing one's own nakedness can lead to improper thoughts, and that can distract you from the full intention that you should have when you recite the Shema. And excrement is not only distracting, but disrespectful. However, one can take a concern for these matters too far, and that's self-sabotaging. So, in the Talmud, they consider the case of a person who aspires to recite the Shema as perfectly as possible. I don't know if anybody knows what it is to recite the Shema in the most perfect way. This is something they did in antiquity and the rabbis tried to do. The most perfect way to do it, the way to do it is just as the sun breaks over the horizon. That was considered to be the ideal. You have a big window of time, several hours that you can recite it, but the perfect time is to do it just as the sun breaks over the horizon. So people aspired to do that. That was seen to be the most perfect or holy way to do it. But what if at that precise moment, the Talmud asks, you're immersing in a ritual bath and you're naked? What should you do? Even if you crouch down to cover your body with water, and they recommend that you do that, crouch down and cover your body with water, and then some bright spark says, yes, but then if you do that, your heel could touch your genitals or be very near it, and that could create a distracting sensation and thought. This is the Talmud. This is why I study Talmud too. It's interesting. So text 16, I cut out, it goes on for pages. I just bring you right down to the end of the discussion, text 16. So Abaya says it's forbidden to recite the Shema in that case, crouched in water naked, if the heel is even near the genitals. But Rava says, no, it's permitted. Why? Because the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. So the law was decided that if the heel touches the genitals, it's forbidden. But if it's just near it, relax already. It's permitted. In other words, what they're saying is, you shouldn't allow your aspiration to recite the Shema at the ideal time to be derailed by worries about your physical body, right? You should recite it even if you're naked and crouching in water, because after all, the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. It was given knowing that we have physical human bodies, and sometimes that means we can't always do things the way we might like, but it would be a mistake on our part to allow our physical body or our physical limitations to derail our aspirations to do something. So the phrase, lo nitna Torah lemalachei hasharet, the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. It sounds like it's a lenience, it's a anti-aspirational. It sounds like it's being lenient and that you don't have to aspire to something, but that's not true. It's the opposite. It serves our aspirations. It's saying, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't think you're so unworthy or so impure or so imperfect that you can't engage in a holy act. Aspire and do it anyway. That's what the phrase really means. The second passage, if you thought that one was fun, text 17, is discussing the requirement to be a certain distance away from excrement when reciting the Shema. You have to be 4 cubits away from excrement. And then the Talmud wonders in typical Talmudic fashion, yes, but what happens in the case that you have feces inside the body? It's not 4 cubits away. So the text says, Rav Papa said, if there is excrement in the anus, he must not recite the Shema. And now the anonymous voice of the Talmud comes back and says, wait a minute, how are we to understand this? Well, if it's visible, then of course. But if it's not visible, surely the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. Go ahead and recite the Shema anyway. I know it's funny, but I hope the principle is coming through. Here again, right, the response is to halt this line of overly scrupulous reasoning, right, that would derail aspirational behavior based on some physical fact of our existence, the fact that we possess a body and so on. If the requirement to distance yourself 4 cubits from excrement extends even to feces within the body, one might never recite the Shema, and that's a sacred, obligatory act, right? As Nike says, just do it. And that's what the rabbis are saying, just do it. The two other cases I didn't bring here, but they're very much the same. The idea that, wait a minute, when we're building the temple, maybe we should never build the temple because the materials, the stones and so on that you use to build the temple, they're sacred, and the workers are going to get tired and they might lean against the wall. And then they're using it for a profane purpose. And so that's a danger. Maybe we shouldn't build the temple. Say, the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. Go ahead and build the sanctuary. Otherwise, you'll never do anything if you're worried. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? That's also the motto here. So in all of these passages, acknowledging and accepting the reality of our embodied nature serves not to dissuade us from engaging in a sacred action or an ideal action, but the opposite, to enable and encourage our aspirations to engage in that course of action, regardless of our embodied nature. It's not incompatible with our aspirations. In a final subversion, the rabbis maintain that not only that humans and angels are different, but also that humans are beloved by God in a way that angels can never be. And so there are some texts that address this special status of humans. They're more beloved than the angels, not only in the world to come, but even in this life right now. So we see this in text number 18. Rabbi Brechia says in the name of Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, in the future, in the end time, the Holy One, blessed be He, is going to set the place of the righteous closer to His throne than the place of the ministering angels. So the righteous will just leapfrog right over the ministering angels and get right to the throne of God. The ministering angels will ask then, what has God done? What did the Holy One, blessed be He, teach you? Well, now we're going to find out it's not just in the end time, but even in this world that they are preferred. Rabbi Levi Bar Chayuta said, and did He not do this already in this world, put humans in front of angels? Because we read in the book of Daniel. So you remember the story of Daniel when the three friends are thrown into the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar is watching, and they're not being consumed by the fire. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, but I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. So there was an angel in there with the three friends. And the appearance of the fourth, that means the three humans, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they went before the angel. He was fourth, and they were putting out the fire before him. So even in this world, God prefers humans to angels. And while those sectarians who lived at Qumran, who I told you about before, they were always trying to imitate the angels and trying to synchronize their worship to the heavenly calendar and aligning their praise and their prayers with that of the angels. The opposite idea appears in the Talmud. This is in text 19. Actually, I didn't bring, the first part of this says that the angels wait until Israel is praying before they start to pray. So they're trying to imitate us. And then it goes on to say this, Israel are dearer to the Holy One, blessed be He, than the ministering angels. For Israel sings praises to the Lord every hour. The ministering angels sing praises once a day. And whereas Israel get to mention the name of God after two words, think about it, Shema, Yisrael, Adonai, name of God, right? You say two words. But the angels, they only get to mention the name of God after three words. Holy, 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 Kadosh, 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 Adonai, right? Because that's from the book of Isaiah. Moreover, the ministering angels do not begin to sing praises in heaven, oh, here it is, until Israel have sung below on earth. They're waiting for us. They imitate us. So unlike many other Jews in the ancient period who felt that we should aspire to be like the angels in all things, the rabbis are depicting the angels as aspiring to model their divine worship on the worship practices of Israel. They imitate humans. So while the Talmud's phrase, the Torah was not given to ministering angels, might appear on the surface, and it has often been interpreted as giving a certain laxity. If you just Google it and look at sermons, it's how it's used very often in sermons. You don't have to aspire for certain things. God is realistic, so don't aspire. I don't think that's really quite what the text means in its original context. It's actually encouraging and enabling aspirationalism. It's conveying a very important halachic, legal, and ethical principle that embodiedness and other facts of our human condition are not antithetical to an aspirational orientation to the Torah, because the Torah can be fulfilled and indeed was designed to be fulfilled by embodied and morally free beings. We certainly are no angels. They're not carnal. They're not morally free. And so we are expected to strive for a different, entirely human perfection, a perfection that encompasses and is predicated on the capacity for moral choice and the possibility of failure, mistake, and sin, and the possession of a physical body with all the limitations that that implies, qualities that angels, to their apparent dismay and frustration, are just not lucky enough to possess. So the Holiness Code, which you've been studying, exhorts Israel repeatedly, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And it connects the aspiration to holiness to the teachings and the laws of the Torah. But in the period just after the Bible, some ancient Jews interpreted the call to holiness as a call to become like holy angels, disembodied automatons obedient to God because they have no other choice. And many of these Jews adopted strict purity practices or asceticism and celibacy to deny the flesh. They sought to eradicate free will, withdrawing from the world and its moral challenges. They focused on obedience and constant worship to God. But Rabbi Akiva and those like him interpreted the call to holiness as a call to be not like the angels who have no free will, but like God, who knows good and evil and chooses good. We won't always succeed, and God knows that. But the call to holiness is a call to take up the challenge of moral living as embodied beings in a material world, to imitate God in using our moral freedom for good when we can, rather than evil. And in the rabbi's hands, the call to holiness is a call to choose the path of life rather than death, to imitate God, not his blind servants, the angels, by working to the best of our imperfect ability to sustain the universe through the creation of a just human community. So thanks for thinking with me today about what it meant to strive for holiness in antiquity. I'm happy to take questions. You notice how sneaky I was to get my other real love in there, which is the Talmud and rabbinic literature. That's where I actually do most of my work, although I do also teach the Bible. But yes, there's a question.
I have a question. Thank you.
Oh, microphone? Yes.
Thank you. I have a question because if the rabbis are developing this kind of theory of discontinuity, right, that humans are not next to the angels because angels are robo-righteous, like you're saying, doesn't it diminish their argument if they're in their midrashim? They're essentially making the angels sound so petty and arguing with God and essentially more like humans.
Yeah, they're making the angels very self-righteous, actually, right? That we're perfectly righteous. Why are you bothering with him? So it's true. I think of it as a fun literary strategy and a kind of an irony, right? That, oh, you think this is so great and a model? First of all, we're nothing like them. And now let's throw a little mud at them at the same time. This is part of the great humor of rabbinic texts. I'm actually writing a book right now on the humor of the Talmud and the rabbis, because I think the Bible is also full of humor. But we miss it so often, and they do all kinds of ironic things. And irony usually, it has those self-contradictions in it in terms of a rational argument. It does, but a lot of it is, I think, for the humor value to get the message across in a fun way. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What do you think the Kabbalists would think of all this?
So I do want to make it clear that there are different strands, obviously, in Jewish thought and literature. And one thing that I did say, and it sometimes is easy to forget this, I said that this idea of discontinuity started to grow up in the rabbinic period. The other one continued. So you'll see rabbinic texts that say, how should the priest stand? There's one in the Palestinian Talmud. How should the priest stand? Well, he should, with his feet side by side or one foot in front of the other. He should stand with one foot in front of the other because that's how the angels stood. And they cite a verse in Isaiah where the angels seem to have one foot. Right? So there's certainly passages in the Talmud that will talk about, will have that same continuity view. But what happens in the rabbinic period in the literature is we get this rebellious other view. And that's the one I shared with you today. So the other view continues, and it's going to come out at different times. And Kabbalah and mysticism have an interesting mix of imitation of God. They're very focused on God as being the source. But they also see the real God as somehow hidden, and that we do understand, or what we see are the sphirot, or the attributes of God, in a way that sort of functions like the angels in some of the earlier literature, manifestations of the divine, but God himself is kind of remote. So they go back to some of that imagery, and we're trying to connect through those intermediary elements. They're not distinct from God. They are part of God's body. but there's still some sense of intermediary. So they are a weird kind of mix, right, of some of this older view, but they also still are very focused on morality. Morality is the way in which we do that imitation. And our moral freedom. So they do believe in moral freedom and that we need to be morally free agents like God and model ourselves on him morally. So they kind of combine the rabbinic with some of these older views of intermediaries between us and God, and we can access through them. Does that make sense? Yeah. As a kid. Yeah, right, yeah. So, and I'm not an expert in Kabbalah, but.
I think we have time for one more question.
The whole idea of focusing on the angels during the period following the Bible and before the rabbis, right, in other words, who were they influenced by to elevate the role of the angels? Because it doesn't appear in the Torah. The Torah, the angels have no such role.
So I can give you kind of the scholarly historical answer if you like. It's very true. We have very little in the Bible. The angels that do appear are not very fleshed out, pardon the pun. They're not really fully fleshed out. Usually it's when God has something negative to do, like the angel of death, right? Rather than God going through and killing the firstborn in Egypt, the angel of death comes through and does it. And when there has to be an interaction with humans, an angel will do it, but they don't have personality. It's just a way of sort of representing God interacting with humans. They're kind of messengers. We do have mentions of a council of angels that God takes counsel with in the book of Psalms, and it's implied in Genesis. But you're right, it's not very fleshed out. So why is it at the end of the period towards the close of the Bible, that suddenly Jews are very interested in all these intermediary beings? So that happens in the Hellenistic period, right? The Greeks, young man named Alexander, ripe old age of 23, decides to conquer the eastern end of the Mediterranean in 320-something. And Hellenistic culture pours in to, the land of Israel, or Palestine at that time, right? So Greek culture, with its many deities and divine beings, one supreme God, others, so many of these ideas are really from an infusion of other cultures that happen in the Hellenistic mix of the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st century. That's why in those 300 years before the rabbis rise, Jews begin to write a very different kind of literature from what we see in the Bible. And they take those little hints of things in the Bible and develop massive stories about all these angels. In Genesis 6 about the angels who see the daughters of men and have intercourse with them, and this is where the Nephilim, I think I talk about this really briefly in the Bible book, but there is, that breeds a whole body of literature about these terrible fallen angels. One book that goes on for 90 or more chapters about them and who they were and what they did, and now you can go up to heaven and see them being punished and all the rest of it. So they took the one or few little mentions in the Bible, and under the influence of this larger cultural interest in intermediary beings between us and the Supreme One, they developed this literature rich in angels. Rabbis are of two minds, right? They sometimes have them, but they also sometimes think it's distracting us from what we should pay attention to. And that is a direct relationship with God and his demand for the moral life.
I want to thank you so much for the wonderful address. And I want to remind everybody, have lunch. And then after lunch, rest up. And then come back here now for the closing lecture at 7:00 p.m. In the sanctuary. And I want to call upon Rini to...
She's behind you. Yeah.
Oh, you're right here.
I want to thank Professor Hayes. I wish I could go back a few years and be at Yale and take classes from you. I found your talk very fascinating, and I vote for aspiration. Okay. So I will echo Rabbi's remark. Come back tonight and learn some more. Thank you so much.